Welcome today. It's great to see such interest in this really important research. But before we go any further, I'll introduce Dale Lynch to do an acknowledgement of people and country. Thank you, Dale.
Ngala Kadich Nunga Mort Kainan Kara Nija Buja. We respectfully acknowledge the past and present traditional owners of this land on which we are meeting, the Noongar people, their elders past, present and future. We pay respects to their continuing cultural, spiritual and religious practices.
Thank you, Dale. And we've got many distinguished guests here today, and I'd firstly like to acknowledge the survivors of institutional abuse who are here with us today. I'd like to welcome Josh Knief, representing the Department of Premier and Cabinet, Catty Kraslin, who's on the acceptance list and maybe here, Prue Gregory, Principal Lawyer with No More, who's over from Sydney, and Greg Boland and staff from the No More Perth office. Charmaine Holyoake Roberts. Okay, nice to put a face to the name. Dr. Rob Guthrie and Karina Hafford of the Criminal Injuries Compensation Tribunal, which is a really hard combination of words to say. Welcome to Louise Lamont, CEO of Phoenix Advocacy Service. Hi. Hi. How are you, Louise? We've got senior representatives here from the Department of Communities and Department of Justice, and Derek Smith, Vice President of the Old Fair Bridgians Association. Representatives here from DSS, National Redress Support, WACOS, Lanterns House, Richmond Wellbeing, Uniting Care West and UWA Social Work. We're also pleased to welcome safeguarding personnel from the Catholic Archdiocese of Perth, the Salvation Army, the Christian Brothers and the Uniting Church. We're heartened by your interest in survivors' experiences of engaging with the Royal Commission. Some of the people who participated in the Royal Commission and in Bec's research are here today, and your interest in this process, what it was like for them, respects and honours their experience, and you're a group of people with the power to effect change. As far as we know, this is the first PhD study of anything to do with the Royal Commission, and it's especially important because it focuses on survivors. Survivors' voices need to be acknowledged as authoritative sources of knowledge about inquiries and commissions. There's also some urgency to record survivors' experiences of engaging in processes like civil claims and redress that have come since the Royal Commission and are much more challenging for participants. And there's very little research on what these processes are like. And that's alarming because it means they're being set up and operated without a clear understanding of what it's really like for the people who take part in them, and that's a real concern. And at the moment we're hearing from survivors who are being unnecessarily traumatised. Some positive outcomes are being reported, but not nearly enough. The current long delays in the court system are a really big problem, and it's not okay to offer new opportunities to survivors of historic abuse and then not put in place resources and support to make them operate in a timely manner. This is particularly true in WA, where thousands of survivors have already been harmed through poorly implemented redress. Already in the last few years, institutions have started to provide redress for badly done redress. They recognise the secondary harm survivors experienced in previous claims processes now require apology and further compensation. So, to introduce our speaker, Bec Moran, known as Bec, is a PhD candidate with the University of New South Wales. She teaches in social work at Curtin University and is a training facilitator for the Blue Knot Foundation. Some of Bec's interviews were conducted at Tuart Place, and we're delighted to welcome her back to present A Safe Place to Tell Lessons from the Australian Child Abuse Royal Commission. Welcome, Bec.
Hello, and thank you so much for being here. As Pip said, it's so heartening as someone who's worked with survivors and particularly concerned about the impact of child sexual abuse for my whole career, to see this swell of interest and the acknowledgement from people from so many disciplines that this is everybody's problem, this is everybody's concern, and that we all have a part to play in facilitating opportunities for healing in all sorts of interactions. And that's really my focus through this presentation, is hopefully to equip each of you who works with survivors with some ideas that can help you, regardless of the system or the circumstances that you work with people in, to work in a way that means that their interaction with the system, with the process, with you, has more chance of being healing than of being re-traumatising. Thank you to Dale for the acknowledgement of country too. I couldn't have done any of this work without the incredible generosity of the survivors who spoke to me. I'm always aware of what an incredible extension of hope and trust it was for people to try and talk again. People have had so many experiences of trying to tell somebody what happened, trying to talk about the impact of what's happened and not being heard. And so for people to engage with the Royal Commission took an extension of hope and trust and faith and some emotional labour. It's a risk to try and engage again, and talking to me required the same kind of risk, the same kind of generosity. And I think there's something to be said for the fierce spirit of survivors. And I think this social movement that we have at the moment, the Royal Commission didn't come out of nowhere. It came from that fierce spirit of survivors and those who work with survivors. The advocacy work that it took to make this happen took years and years and is often invisible. And I think we see that in the voices of each person who spoke to the Royal Commission, and we see that in the voices of my research participants too. I'd also like to acknowledge my supervisors, particularly Michael Salter, who's been my primary supervisor from the beginning. I've had lots of supervisors. These are my current supervisors. So locally I have Donna Chung from Social Worker Curtin. I'll give you a very brief overview of the method and the framing. So I did semi-structured interviews, which means really I just asked people, tell me about your experience with the Royal Commission. I had a set of things that I wanted to know about, but if people wanted to talk about something else, then I would trust that that was important and go with that where it went. I spoke to 26 people in the end. The age range was from 24 years old to 86 years old, with an average age of 53. But just to put that in some perspective, only 3 of those participants were under the age of 40. So the majority of people sat between kind of 40 and 65, which is what we kind of expect from the cohort that was eligible to participate in the Royal Commission. 15 of those were women, 10 men and 1 non-binary. Interesting, because that wasn't the gender split of the Royal Commission. This was a moment in history where male survivors of abuse were speaking up publicly more than ever before. I didn't ask a question about race because that requires changes to the ethics process, and because it wasn't a focus of my research. It would be nice to know more about the demographics of participants, but I made a decision to really the only criteria for participation was having made a victim submission to the Royal Commission. That was my only criteria, and I didn't ask a lot of questions beyond that. I asked people about why they wanted to speak to the Royal Commission and what it was like for them, what it was like at the time, what the process was like, and what the ongoing impact has been. And I think there's something interesting I started speaking to people about 2 months before the Royal Commission closed, and I finished my last interview about 6 months after it closed. And I think there's something you can see in there, in a pattern in perhaps fading hope, or people's sense of excitement and hope that this was going to be really the big game changer, and then a few months later that was already starting to fizzle out. So I'd really like to speak to people again, and I'd also really like to speak to people with the New Zealand Royal Commission, but one thesis at a time. I'll finish this one first. So once I'd interviewed people, I transcribed the interviews and then I set to work analysing them in a really, in a way that was focused very much on what people had said to me. So I had a framework I was working in, which was within the literature on the impacts of trauma, so psychosocial trauma theory, and also some literature and thinking around critical social theory and political philosophy. But I certainly wasn't going to ignore what people had said to me to make it fit that framing. So I've tried to, and I hope you'll be able to see in the presentation, that I've tried to really leave participants' voices very much intact and be very much led by what people have told me and the words that people have used rather than my voice dominating. And I think that's a part of trauma-informed practice. As Pip said, I'm a trainer for the Blue Knot Foundation. I teach trauma-informed practice all the time. I have been for years. This is my bread and butter, and I was determined not to do research in an exploitative way or in a way where I held all the power. I couldn't bear if people's interaction with me was more of the same. And anyone who's been to my training would know that I'm forever banging on about the opportunity to either do more of the same and to cause further harm, or to do something different. So trauma-informed practice is important in every piece of my interaction with participants, from things like keeping my word, about when I'm going to call, about working in relationships so that people have the opportunity to test my trustworthiness and to make a decision with choice, with control about whether to engage with me and how to engage with me. And it's also important at the later stages as well, in analysis and in feeding my work back. And that's part of why I'm here today. Tuart Place staff and participants were so generous in welcoming me here, and people participating in interviews. So it's important to me to be back here giving something back and to be sharing the findings of my research back with Tuart Place as one of the earliest places for... I should probably be doing more writing and less, but this is important. This was something that really mattered to me. So the findings, and there's lots of layers to the findings, and this presentation can only look at a small chunk, and I've tried to choose what is most relevant and most usable immediately for this group, and that group including survivors, what's going to be meaningful and interesting to reflect on what might make survivors who participated in the research or who didn't participate but are part of this cohort to feel heard and represented, and also for people working with survivors, particularly around redress and civil claims. What can you grab, take home with you and use straight away? So I think that this might be familiar to those of you that have been involved with the Royal Commission and have worked with survivors, that when it was done well, when people felt valued, safe, seen and heard, believed, when they felt like they were in good hands and like they mattered, people described the Royal Commission as being incredibly meaningful, as transformational, and one of the most significant healing experiences of their lives. Now, the flip side to that is that when the Royal Commission didn't do its job so well, and on the whole I think it's the best we've ever had internationally. This Royal Commission was the best space we've ever had for really hearing and honouring survivors, but it wasn't perfect. Something of that scale to get it right every single time is impossible. So it did well, but it dropped the ball a few times, and there's lessons to learn in that. So when people didn't feel safe, valued, believed and heard, then they experienced the Royal Commission as re-traumatising, as compounding the messages and impacts of trauma and abuse, and as adding new trauma to the burden of hurt that people already carry. So although I didn't ask people about their experiences of abuse or their previous experiences of disclosure, of trying to tell somebody what happened to them, everybody really organically explained what the Royal Commission was like for them in the context of their previous experiences. So people would say, when I tried to tell my mum, she responded in this way and it made me feel this way, and then when I spoke to the Royal Commission, they responded in this way and it made me feel this way. So And this was so consistent that everyone I spoke to did this kind of comparing and contrasting description where they would either tell me that the Royal Commission was more of the same and compounded trauma and was just the same again, which was extra crushing because they'd had hope that it might be different. Or they said, this was so different, this was different to anything else I've ever experienced. So then I started to, in my analysis, I looked at two aspects to that. What was it that was so meaningful? Why was it healing for people? And what were the conditions that facilitated it either being healing or re-traumatising? And what I saw was this really compelling set of themes that I've sort of paraphrased and summarised here, but they were so consistent across all participants, telling me that the messages of abuse, and not just of abuse, of responses, of bystanders' responses, of systems and services responses. It's from, trying to tell your mum at the time, or telling the school principal, or going to the police, or accessing mental health services, that these messages, which I've grouped as abuse messages, were across people's lifespans. They were in the processes of abuse. People heard these messages from perpetrators, and they heard them repeatedly from many, many other people across the lifespan. So that's quite convincing. If you keep getting shown the same thing, that becomes a fact of life and a fact in your understanding of yourself. And when people talked about the Royal Commission as something very healing, they told me about a different set of messages, a healing set of messages, which sit in a kind of a symmetrical contrast to those abuse messages. So just to unpack a couple of the examples there. The top one, no one will believe you. So perpetrators often say to people, don't tell, they won't believe you anyway. People do tell, and it turns out the perpetrator was right. They aren't believed. Or they're silenced, which tells them you don't matter, which tells them that abusers are more credible and important than you. We have so many structures in our systems that are charged with responding to child sexual abuse and preventing child sexual abuse that will reinforce that message, that abusers are more important and oftentimes more credible. It's not, in the history of people trying to talk about child abuse, about trauma, and particularly about child sexual abuse, survivors haven't been well believed. It's a really consistent experience, which I think anyone who's worked with survivors knows this. So then for the Royal Commission to respond with words, actions and processes that said, we believe you. Beyond that, we acknowledge, we recognise the significance of what's happened to you, we recognise the significance of the impacts, and we recognise the wrongdoing of perpetrators and those who were complicit, or those who didn't do enough. All of these things have messages in them for the survivor about what they're worth and how significant their experience was. Let me just read you a quote here from one of my participants that I've put here just to demonstrate the potential for healing, which I think has relevance when we think about, the potential for healing can take us this far forward, but it can also highlight for us what we've missed when we get it wrong in working with people. And I think you can see through this, there's those messages, and I think there's messages that you can convey in your work with people. I've used pseudonyms for all participants, by the way, unless they've specifically requested that I use their real name. So Larry said, I have a very clear image of Commissioner Atkinson talking to me, and it's a bit like the father, if you like, a very generous, open father saying, I understand what you've told me, and you're an acceptable person. That's what I heard. I understand what happened to you, and I understand that you're an acceptable person, that you are okay. And that's what I walked away with. To me, that was really quite profound, because it meant that all the things that I'd been believing, that I wasn't an okay person, that I was second rate, that I really was a blight on humanity, were being challenged. And he was the first person that actually really challenged them. And he was a person with status. A Royal Commissioner, that's a pretty, in my mind, that was a really high status person telling me I'm okay. And that was really powerful for me. And so from that, I took away the sense that, yes, I can move on from here, that I can do something. So I walked away feeling reassured. I walked away feeling of some value. I walked away feeling that as a human being, that I did have some potential, that I could make my life better. that's an incredible opportunity to do that for more people, and it's symbolic. Perhaps it fades out with time, I don't know, but this is significant for someone to say that all my life I've felt like a blight on humanity, and to be witnessed and recognised in this way has enabled him to walk out of that room feeling I'm okay, that I have hope of a future, that I'm a good, decent person. I'll unpack the conditions that facilitate the significance of that interaction between that process of witnessing and recognition. But I really do believe that there's an opportunity for something like this in all of our work with survivors, regardless of what our relationship and role might be. And regardless of how traumatic the systems we work in might be. One of the themes that I think is most important was this idea of mattering or not mattering, which I can also think about as dignity, and it's related to recognition, but I think in the simplest terms and the language that most accurately fits what people told me, it's about mattering or not mattering. Having been told for a lifetime in 1,000 different ways, you don't matter, and then to have another experience which says in a powerful, believable, contextualised way, you do matter. You matter personally and you matter as a group. So Alison said, as a victim of child sexual abuse, you're just treated like you don't matter as a person. You're irrelevant. You're inconsequential. So what about you, It makes your presence, your lack of presence, your pain, your joys, your failings, your whatever, that none of it matters. And Alison talked a lot about her experience when she tried to speak up at the time of abuse, that the institution either didn't believe her or refused to believe her, and she was really kicked out of the whole community. So then as a teenager, she lost her family, she lost her entire community, and this told her in no uncertain terms that her happiness, her safety, and the significance of her experience did not matter, because here was everyone in her life going to great lengths to deny what had happened to her and to deny her pain. And the ways that happens play back into those messages that I've said before of being told that, you invited this, that you were promiscuous, that you're just crazy, you're imagining it. All of these messages were all occurring at once and feeding into each other and compounding each other's impacts. To leave her very alone, she said it was like a form of homelessness and tribelessness. And then the way she spoke about the Royal Commission, and I think this just demonstrates this symmetry and this potential so clearly. She said the Commissioner turned her chair towards me and just listened. She just looked at me and listened, and I wasn't interrupted, and there was no objection, and there was no, can we stop that there? It was just these people who are part of our normal government system and our normal judicial system, and who represent all of us in Australia, and who are doing this on behalf of the Australian government. It was like I'm sitting here and they're listening to me. They're listening to my story and they're acknowledging me. And I just cannot tell you how, for me, what a pivotal moment that was. I felt like I could have worn a cloak out there that said, I matter, on the back of it. Something else that people talked a lot about was credibility, of knowing that as survivors, and whether that's as children, as young adults, across the lifespan again, that their credibility was compromised because of the popular response to people saying, I've been hurt, I've been abused. That pervasive disbelief, and the ways that disbelief is kind of framed and justified. Jodie said, and of course, I'm not a very good witness because I've got mental health issues. I used to be a drug addict, all of that stuff, which we know that impacts on mental health, that are pulled towards things like drug use and alcohol, that these are ways that survivors cope with the impacts of abuse. These are the things that people have to do, and there's an incredible resourcefulness in the things that people do to survive. And then those very same survival strategies are turned back on people to attack and undermine their credibility. Marilyn said, they just say, well, you were young, this is fantasy. The next line of defence is, you're crazy, you're making this up. So many people have been told this in so many ways, which I think leaves, a very clear and obvious thing that we can all do. Whenever someone tells us about what's happened to them, we believe them. We show them that we believe them. We embody that, we enact that in all of our work with people. And that alone can be such a powerful counter experience that can be transformative. Sonia talked about the way that she felt her credibility was restored. And again, this is not just credibility about what happened, it's a credibility applied to people's description of how much that mattered, of the impact of what had happened to them. She said it was such an official thing and it's nationwide to be able to actually sit there and tell somebody what happened to you as a young child and have them accept it. They weren't looking down on me, they weren't putting me down, they weren't saying, come off it, you're exaggerating, or anything like that. I was able to sit there and tell them actual factual information about what was done to me as a 3-year-old child in out-of-home care where I should have been safe. I think that's something that the Royal Commission did quite well, and which is quite unprecedented, the scale of this, of acknowledging this is not just about the actions of perpetrators and abusers. This is about the failure in moral duty of everyone who didn't do enough, whether people knew and actively concealed things, or whether they just should have known or should have been able to respond better, or even without knowing could have responded better. And that was really meaningful for people as well. That was another thing that people talked about as being brand new in their life and as transformational. That I mattered so much that not just the perpetrator was in the wrong, that the people who did nothing have also committed a wrong. So now I want to talk a bit about the conditions that made this work or not work. So you might have heard in some of those quotes, people are talking about the status of the commission, that Larry talked about, that this is a commissioner. This guy's important. He's spending his time with me. Larry also talked about the commissioner's credibility and sort of how hard he would be to fool, saying, he's an ex-police commissioner, he knows about this stuff and he still believes me, he's still listening to me and believing me. That's the status of the commission as a whole, which is in things like the scale of the financial investment by the government, the time investment that it ran for so many years, that it travelled and tried to create access for people. The way that the media portrayed the commission was important too, that people had seen that this was a big thing in our community, in our politics, in our national government, and in conversations in people's lives. But this was, the opportunity that existed there was just lost if people didn't feel safe. The ways that safety is facilitated are nuanced and dynamic and vary from person to person. And the Royal Commission had to set things up in a kind of a scalable way where they could have a certain approach and try and apply it to everybody. But several people mentioned that particular, the generalising of what a survivor looks like and what their needs might be as one of the things that made them feel invisible again, that made them feel like they didn't fit. Even before it starts, there's a big chunk of our population that were made to feel like they didn't fit. People who experienced physical abuse or neglect rather than sexual abuse. People who have been abused in families and community rather than institutions. So for those who did fit in the broad blob of the Royal Commission, to then be made to feel like they didn't fit within it was traumatic. Again, it echoes the messages of abuse. People talked about the middle years as being safer on the whole, which makes sense, that the Royal Commission in the early days was sort of getting the hang of things, was trying to work things out, and in the middle it sort of figured out what its plan was, it was working quite well, it had its support systems in place, and then at the end, when things were winding down, the people in the last few months got a bit of a raw deal as well, when things like that private sessions were no longer available, so people had to fill out the form to do a written submission, which, as is on all of our minds with redress, can be a very difficult process. One of the most important things was the fact that the Royal Commission was different to the criminal justice system and different to the civil law context, in that it wasn't adversarial. It had a starting position of, we're willing to believe you, we're going to believe you, we're acknowledging that this has happened in a general community sense, and that meant that as individuals trying to tell their stories, that the likelihood of being personally, individually believed was high as well. And people knew that. People had seen it in the media and thought, maybe this will be different. Maybe this will be the place that is safe for me to tell. So then if it was, that was fabulous. But if it wasn't safe for them, then that was devastating, because they'd tried to trust. They'd tried to hope. They'd extended their faith and had had those messages confirmed once more in a devastating way. Just a little bit more about fitting or not fitting. I spoke to a few people who were frustrated by a sense that they could only be, that as someone making a victim submission, that they were expected to be a certain way and they were only able to make a certain kind of contribution. So people, for example, who had experiences of abuse but were also a mandatory reporter or also worked in a church, that they felt like they just weren't quite the right shape, that they didn't, and so that left parts of their experience or parts of their identity unheard and unseen. Likewise, someone that was talking about her experience of being abused by female perpetrators, that just had this sense that she didn't fit. People that were trying to separate out the parts of their abuse that had occurred in the context of institution, and trying to not talk about the stuff that happened in the family, but talk about the stuff that happened in the institution. Again, there's parts that are unheard, parts that are told you don't fit. And I don't want to sound like I'm being critical here. As I've said, I think this is the best example we've ever had, but I do want to highlight the moments when it went wrong, because there's valuable learning in that. So Bettina had an amazing experience with her private session, and she said they groomed me to trust them. It had been such a good experience, and she felt so safe that when they asked her to be a part of a public hearing, she agreed. And then that adversarial habit crept back in, and the institution and the lawyers representing the institution got very aggressive. She got caught by surprise. She got a phone call the night before saying a particular piece of evidence was that the institution was wanting to bring in, and this was personal letters from 35 years ago, that the person that she'd sent them to had died, and somehow the institution had gotten a hold of these letters and was trying to use them to discredit her, to say, look, she's crazy. Here she is in these letters talking about seeing visions and magical thinking. And so they were trying to bring in this evidence that was sacred to her, where she was completely caught by surprise and where she felt stripped naked in front of all of these people, and where her fragile hope was completely crushed. She said that was extreme trauma that day in the public hearing. They just kept letting this guy go on and talking as if I was a liar and that I'd said things that were untrue. And then you had the counsel assisting the commission saying, oh, what do we do here? We've got a prior inconsistent statement. And I'm thinking, no, you haven't. And it was like the commission had decided that I'd lied. It was really horrendously distressing, and the commissioners had watched it go on. And when they rang me on that day and were talking to me, they said, we heard how institutions attack witnesses, but we've never seen it happening before our eyes. And I thought, well, it wasn't just before your eyes. You were in control of it. You could have stopped it at any time. But they were so bound up in their normal legalistic protocol that although they were supposedly we were there for healing and to assist them in their work, actually we were treated, I wasn't treated that way. Bettina's father was a judge, and she'd grown up around lawyers, around courtrooms. She was very skilled at self-advocacy, and she was good at navigating this system. So she fought on that day. But still, she was, I had an email from her about a month ago saying, in summary, I'm starting to feel a bit better. But she was absolutely floored by this experience, that she stopped being able to work, that she was devastated physically, emotionally, that she went back to a trauma state she'd been in years before, of being terrified to go out in public, but feeling unsafe in all of her relationships. A devastating impact, because this adversarial, we don't believe you, we must attack your credibility as a witness, crept back in. So I just prompt you to think about why that knowledge matters in the context of redress and civil claims, and what the impact might be for people of those adversarial structures and ways of navigating. And she said, I just felt, in the end I think I said, I feel like I've been hit by a car, run over. I've managed to crawl over to the gutter, and that's pretty much all I can do. It was horrendous. It was like I'd trusted, yet again, I'd trusted in the Commission, and after trusting in people again, I've had everything just wiped away. You see the potential on one side, with Larry talking about how he left, that feeling like I've been seen, I've been acknowledged, I'm leaving this place feeling like I have hope, I'm a good person, I have a future, that people care about me. And Bettina leaving feeling I should never have tried. That all those other messages were the true ones, that you can't trust people, you won't be believed, I don't matter. Another example that I think is very relevant for redress, Charlie talked about the trouble that she had as someone who'd, so she lives with an intellectual and neurological health condition. She has trouble with some of her physical daily functioning. She has trouble with managing the impacts of trauma. And she's had many experiences of abuse in multiple institutions from multiple perpetrators. Her memories of it are very fragmented, as trauma memories are. To ask people to bring out a really nice, coherent, orderly account of what's happened, where the dates are correct and the names are correct and the context is correct, is just very much in conflict with what we know about how traumatic memory is stored and retrieved. Add to that it's terrifying, it's triggering to then have to think about this stuff, to summon up those memories and try to write them on a form. Charlie struggled somewhat with literacy, but she was trying to support a lot of other people who'd grown up in similar institutions, many of them whom were homeless, and she was so focused on trying to help everybody fill out their forms and wasn't able to access support because, as she said so eloquently, she doesn't trust institutions. And why should she? That she was on her own, that she was trying to support all these other people who felt on their own, and this was in the last few months of the Royal Commission. So this was a central thing in her life for months. She was very, very impacted, and she missed the deadline. She didn't get the form in on time, and she was told it wouldn't be accepted. So all of that was for nothing. All of that stirring up, all of that distress, all of that confirmation of being alone was for nothing because they didn't hear her. She says, I wrote it on the form that we were meant to write it on. I found the whole process. I didn't get any support in that process when I needed support because of my disability. My ability to finish it was impacted by my complex trauma and my disability. And I was going to submit it and it was too late. They wouldn't let me submit it, like I missed the cut-off deadline. Yeah, and then I was already so traumatised with the whole process of digging up all of that trauma for the submission and the report that I wrote for them, for my experiences in multiple institutions, and then they wouldn't even hear me out on that. I feel like they should have more understanding for people who experience trauma issues. I think that's a very valid point, and relevant for redress for people who are trying to fill out the claim form on their own or with support. We need to think about what kind of support people need. We need to find out from people what kind of support they need. And if we're going to find out from people what support they need, we need to have built a relationship where they trust us enough to be able to tell us what they need. And Charlie said, the whole process made me feel silenced by the system. It was like inside institutions and how that made me be forced to just shut up because you had to do that to survive. Again, the compounding of trauma versus the potential to have been a different experience for her, to have given her a different message. So to talk some more about the status, the conditions for healing, what made it work so well. And this sense that this was being nationally acknowledged, that this was being acknowledged by these individual people who many participants described as being very warm, very human, that this was a big official thing. It was full of, ceremony and the symbolism of it being a formal structure and a formal process. But within it, when the commissioners managed to be really humane and really connected with people as individuals, then that combination of being individually heard and collectively recognised was powerful for people. Many people talked about wanting to be a part of this historical record, that they could deny us individually, but 8,000 voices saying the same thing has to be heard. And they talked about this collective voice and a historical record, and Richard is talking about that here, and talking about the status and what that communicated to him about his worth. I told my story and it's recorded, and it's like I've told my story to society. It's like I've told my story to the authorities. I'm not just a nobody or keeping it a secret or living in silence. I've told my story to the highest authorities, and that's an important thing to me. And Alison said, I felt empowered, I was relieved. I felt like I packed everything into a box and handed it to them, and it was like an unburdening. I felt like, well, this is my story and you have it now. I don't know what you can do with it. I don't know where this is going to go, but it's yours now. And several people talked about leaving it on the desk, about handing it over. Like, here you go. Here it is, yours. I'm walking away from it. I'm walking out unburdened. I also thought a lot about, this is the status of the witness, the status of the Royal Commission as a whole and of the individual commissioners and other people involved in it. But there was something about the status of the people talking to, the status that was awarded to victims, to survivors, where rather than accessing therapeutic services, where the power and the expertise is on the side of the therapist or the clinician, that where the therapist has the expertise, has the power, is paid to be there, paid to listen, and can maybe help you heal your brokenness. In this context, people were listened to because they had something very valuable to contribute to a better future for our whole society, where they had expertise through their experience and where that was really honoured. So there's a different dynamic there that I think might also be useful to think about for those working in therapeutic settings, about how you can change the status of each party so that people feel recognised, where we can have some of these impacts of recognition, of witnessing in everyday circumstances. So the hope, I tended to start with, and actually many people I didn't get to ask a single question through the whole interview, they were just off and they all talked about why they were there, that people wanted to stop injustices. They wanted to make a difference to having better services provided for survivors, to speak for those friends and family members who hadn't survived or haven't got the opportunity for a voice. They wanted to change something culturally and historically so that when children in the future need to tell someone, that they encounter something different, that they could tell someone and be believed and supported instead of having the same experience. People also wanted a sense that someone was being held accountable. Lots of people talked about wanting what I came to think of as something like reputational justice, saying this institution, everybody thinks they're so good and I want people to know the truth, that they're not as clean and they're not as good as they say they are. That which again is relevant for redress in that aspect, which might be about apology, about acknowledgement, that there's symbolic things that are very healing and then there's concrete things that are also very important. So symbolic healing is important but possibly not enough on its own, that as well as being acknowledged, being recognised, people also want to have an opportunity to get back some of what their life could have been like otherwise, that people talked about that my early education was disrupted, that my career's been disrupted because of the impacts of trauma. I look around, I'm in my 60s, I look around and I see other people have got family, they've got grandchildren, they own their own home, they're retiring, they've got superannuation, and I'm on a public housing list waiting to see if I have somewhere to live as I age. So there's a very concrete aspect that requires some kind of restoration or redress. And we can't ever do enough. Whatever we do, it's not going to put the balance back. We can't restore people to a pre-abuse state. We can't give people the life they might have had otherwise. So it becomes even more important that we do the very best we can with what's available, and in that concrete, financial, actually practically useful way, and also in the relational and the symbolic way. As I said at the beginning, that I'd be very interested to talk to people now as we get further down the track, as Redress is active, that in the last few months people were so excited, saying, this is it, things are going to change, things are going to be better. And then even a few months later going, no, this is just the same, this is like the Bringing Them Home report, it's just like all these other things where there was a big fuss made and now it's just going to fade back and nothing will change. And I don't think it's been that bad. There's definitely are changes happening, and it's the biggest change I've ever seen on the topic of child sexual abuse and prevention and response. But it's quite heartbreaking to see that the ways that the good work of the Royal Commission is being undone or contradicted in the enactment of the National Redress Scheme. That people who were told that they mattered and then having a different experience that tells them again, you didn't matter. What does that do? What does that do to the healing that they got there? What does that do to their sense of themselves and their trust in the community and in systems and people? I find it quite unbearable and heartbreaking, really, that especially when you see the potential that was there for this to be a life-changingly healing experience. And we come back in with a bureaucratic adversarial process that just is wiping it all away. Kirsten said, I guess a bit of fear is that with everything that's been done with the Commission, that it's forgotten, that it's not teased out, and the government doesn't get behind things enough. I think it's still a bit early to make a full evaluation of that, and there's work going on over at University of Newcastle and University of New South Wales to do an evaluation, and with Blue Knot Foundation as well, to really evaluate the implementation of the Royal Commission's recommendations. So we'll see more about that in the next few years. Lauren said, post-Royal Commission, I'm not holding my breath, but at least I'll feel like I had my 2 cents worth. In terms of services, who knows if we'll see any changes. Lauren talked a lot about things like how ridiculous it is to get 6 Medicare-covered sessions with a psychologist, and that, complex trauma takes more support than that. And the impacts of complex trauma often mean that navigating those systems of doing that advocacy work to get more sessions, to get access to resources is extra difficult for people. Veronica said, we just have to start to get stuff happening. It's only going to get worse for us unless things change. A redress scheme is not going to sort that out. And she was talking about things like ageing and having nowhere to live, not having access to services. Several people talked too about the challenge that's coming for a population that are ageing, that were abused in institutions, and if you're getting older and health problems related to ageing are becoming, if you're needing support and you haven't got lots of super, you haven't got private health insurance, so you don't own your own home, so many of our aged care services are provided by institutions, and institutions that might be or appear to be connected with or similar to the institutions where abuse occurred in the first place. So I think about the impacts of something like dementia setting in and people's mental and internal safeguards against intrusive trauma memories, and then being back in an institution and powerless and helpless. I don't know that we've done enough to respond to this, and it's a big social issue that's coming up very quickly. So just to wrap up here, think about the implications of all of this, and I think, what do we do? How can we have this for other survivors? How do we have this for survivors of abuse in the family, of physical abuse, of emotional abuse, neglect? How do we make this available when there's not this landmark, exceptional Royal Commission going on? Because it's the first of its kind with that scale and that attunement of implementation, it's not going to happen again anytime soon because they're really expensive and really difficult to do. So what's available every day? What can we do better in our therapeutic services, in our legal services, in our criminal justice system? What's available for people to have that same kind of experience with the dynamics there of being safe, of feeling seen and heard, of feeling valued, of feeling witnessed in a way that recognises the significance of what's happened to people, the significance of the impact and their credibility as a survivor. Where is that available in everyday circumstances? Several participants said that doing the interview was similar, that it has the same kind of meaning for them, and it was like a wrap-up, it was a reflection, it was another way of being on that historical record and being part of that collective voice. People who'd felt really unheard by the Royal Commission said that doing the interview was a kind of remedy for that they didn't hear me, maybe you can, maybe I can go on the record here. I work in a space at Curtin Uni where we do a lot with lived experience educators, and people are paid for their expertise through their lived experience, and people participate in guest lectures and guests at workshops, but also in developing curriculum and in marking student assessments. So that I'm looking for all these places where these dynamics might exist, and I think that might be another possibility where people can come and speak to a room like this and really be heard and be believed, being treated like they matter. Speaking to the media is another possibility, but that can go really kind of haywire. It can get very out of control. The media aren't, they're operating by a different set of ethics than researchers are or lawyers. I've seen a few of my research participants in the months since the Royal Commission, and then they went on to have very publicly visible criminal trials with their perpetrators, and then have been very kind of prominent in the media around this. And I can see that there's huge value, but I can also see the fatigue and the potential for exploitation and for feeling very, very exposed. And as I learnt very harshly when my own engagement with the media years ago, the internet is forever and the internet is international. So what we do with the media can come back to haunt us later when we feel differently, to thinking, I wouldn't say that now, I want my privacy back, I want quiet, I don't want to be a public figure, and I don't want to be a target. Thinking about therapeutic relationships, the dynamics of therapeutic relationships, there's a bit of a paradox in that people have told me that one of the things that was really made this work was the status of the Commission and of the individuals within the Royal Commission. So it was that, the high status, quite a patriarchal, Larry talked about being the father, and so that's giving a higher status to the witness than, say, a social worker or a therapist. But then I don't think that will be very helpful in therapeutic work with survivors. Increasing the status and power of therapists or people working therapeutically with survivors is in conflict with the status that was awarded to victims and survivors in the Royal Commission, where they are experts, where they're making a valuable contribution, where those processes of witnessing and recognition occur. So I don't have an answer, I just want to flag it. I think it's something worth considering in individual practice and also in our service design. And then the criminal justice system. It's pretty set in its ways. It's quite hard to change, but surely there's some scope for change. Surely, with all that we know now about what helps survivors and what harms survivors, surely we can make some changes. Surely we can, the use of victim impact statements are now providing people with an opportunity to be heard in a way that previously wasn't available in criminal justice responses to child sexual abuse. But the process is just so adversarial, is that approach of undermining the credibility of the complainant is just so completely contradictory to everything that we see here for the potential for healing. Again, I don't have an answer, but I want to flag it and I want to prompt people to think about individual practice in that context. One of my participants talked about, her perpetrator had been charged It had gone all the way up to a week before the trial. This is over the space of, I think, 2.5 to 3 years. And a week before the trial, it got canned, it got dropped. And yet she still talks about that as a very worthwhile and healing experience, because her relationship with the detective who investigated everything was, he heard her, he believed her, he witnessed her, he treated her like she mattered. So still on the whole, in what would seem on paper to be a very unrewarding, very disappointing outcome, she still said, I'm so grateful for it because I got more heard than many people ever will. That all the time that he gave me, all the effort that he went to, all the outrage that he had, his certainty about the perpetrator's wrongdoing and about her innocence and her credibility, that it was still transformative and healing. So I prompt you to think about that too, that whatever prickly system you might work in, can you do relationship with people in a way that still has some of these valuable impacts? And last of all, some implications for future inquiries. We're doing a lot more of this now. We can see it internationally and we can see it in Australia as well. We've got the Disability Royal Commission, we've got inquiry into abuse in aged care. There's a lot going on. We're doing this more and more. And I think it's, as you can see, there's huge potential for it to be very healing, but there's also huge potential for it to be exploitative and traumatic for people. So if we're going to keep asking this of people, that they step forward and tell their stories, because that's always going to cost something. That's never going to be easy for people to do. I think there's a moral duty to do that as well as possible. And some of the things that I've seen that make that safer for people, demonstration of trustworthiness, and that needs to be done in lots of ways. It needs to be done individually and personally on that, intimate kind of individual relational level. But with this Royal Commission, it was also done in a very generalised, publicly visible way. People saw the media portrayals of what was happening. People heard from other survivors about what their encounter had been like. That this demonstration of trustworthiness is far more complex than saying, you can trust me. In fact, saying you can trust me to an abuse survivor is very unlikely to convince anyone. And the same with safety. You must demonstrate it. You must think about it, and it has to be done very flexibly. It has to be done in an attuned way that people can feel, like Charlie talking about the complete lack of support, that she felt invisible, she felt like she didn't matter, she felt like she didn't fit, and ultimately she felt unheard because the support provided wasn't enough for her. Another participant, Nathan, talked about feeling like he didn't fit, feeling unheard, because the support was targeted at him with an expectation that he would be accessing mental health services, that he would be very vulnerable and that he could only speak in a certain way. He wanted an opportunity to do things like sitting on the reference and advisory groups and to submit issues papers, and because he was first and foremost seen as a victim, those opportunities weren't made available for him. So there's no blanket answer. We just need to be attuned to people, and we need to find out what people need. Embedding that communication of belief and recognition, which I've heard a few people talk today about. People know that that's important now, and we can see it clearly in that history. People who haven't been believed, people who've had their experience denied, regardless of what the payment might be in terms of financial redress or civil awards, that there's opportunities for people along the way to say, I do believe you, I acknowledge what's happened to you, I acknowledge the wrongdoing, I see you and I see what happened to you. Valuing people, I'm thinking about, again, that extension of hope and faith and trust. If people go to the personal risk and the effort of dredging up painful memories and telling someone what's happened, and then nothing changes, what does that tell people about how much they're valued, about how much their experience matters? Appreciating that extension of hope and what it might cost people to have that hope crushed. And understanding those parallel processes, the way people are treated in public inquiries can either be profoundly healing or profoundly traumatic. And again, I think that's an ethical and a moral duty that people who've already been so hurt, we need to do our very best in all of our work with them. And I think that's all. There we go.